Why are boomers more pro-Israel than younger generations? Because people forget power dynamics with the passage of time. Beforehand, the American left widely supported Israel precisely because it was seen as the smaller and less powerful country constantly struggling to survive. https://www.cbc.ca/news/politics/Israel-Hamas-Gaza-Canadians-polling-1.70222927. For the first 50 years of the 75 years this conflict has been raging, Israel was fighting the combined might of the entire Arab League that desperately wanted to slaughter every single one of them. The older European generations grew up under the threat of Palestinian attacks on European soil. There's so many of them that this Wikipedia page subdivides them by countries. I can almost say with absolute certainty that if your country had a dedicated anti-terrorism unit pre-9/11, it was created to fight PLO sleeper cells in Europe from trying to target your country's Jews. https://en.wikipedia.org/wiki/category:palestinian_terrorist_incidents_in_Europe. But over time, the conflict changes scope. In 1979, it is no longer Israel versus Egypt, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Palestine, and half the Muslim world that ethnically cleansed all their Jews and called for the destruction of the state where all those Jews fled to. It is now Israel versus Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Palestine as Egypt makes a peace treaty. This is the way of the world as boomers remember the Israel-Arab conflict to have been, when there was a good chance for a second Holocaust to have happened as the Arab armies were so numerous compared to the Jews that Israel had to conscript its mothers and daughters into combat positions to be capable of closing the gap. Suddenly it's 1993 and 1994, when Palestine and Jordan make peace, respectively. The PLO puts down its arms for the first time and accepts a diplomatic solution to the conflict. This is what Gen X grew up with and still remember. For the first time the Palestinians stopped being seen as a strictly homicidal and genocidal people that stop at nothing but the destruction of Jews around the planet. It is now Israel versus Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran. The first and second intifadas erupt in 1987 and 2003. Israel brutally quashes them both down, ending with the blockade of Gaza. This is in the middle of the 9/11 world, where Americans at the time found a sympathetic ear for the Israeli plight. If you tuned into CNN during the 2003 era, you would see weekly news of suicide bombings happening in Israel, with blown-up supermarkets and grocery stores and public places, culminating with 42 suicide bombings in a single year. And news of Palestinian child suicide bombers and blood-curdling rhetoric from the PLO and Hamas calling for the mass slaughter of every single Jew on the planet being mainstream. It is only post-2003 that Israel managed to secure overwhelming military power, where the power dynamics became completely one-sided. It is only post-1993 that the Arab-Israeli conflict, where 400 million Arabs unilaterally declared war on 7 million Jews, became the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where the focus is no longer on the outside Arabs. Syria and Lebanon were still threats, but the Arab Spring destroyed Syria as a potential threat to Israel and severely weakened Lebanon to the point the Lebanese defense forces became a joke. It is now Israel versus West Bank and Gaza, Iran and a weak Lebanon and a destroyed Syria. This is the world millennials still remember. We fast forward to 2014, Hezbollah has taken over Lebanon. It is a paramilitary organization representing Iran. Gaza has been deeply drained of its power and economy. As it's been locked behind a blockade, the West Bank becomes more and more pacified as the Israelis divide it up and the PLO puts down its arms. The only opponents left become terror groups as the PLO refuses to engage in warfare. The fight is now between Israel versus Gaza, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, PFLP, Iran and Hezbollah, as Lebanon and Syria are out of the picture. This is the world Gen Z grew up with. We're in 2024. Israel is now fighting Gaza alone. It is now Israel versus Hamas, where Gazans are literally caught in the crossfire. It is no longer a weak, desperate, paranoid, freshly genocide 5 million strong Israel fighting the 240 million strong Arab League coalition, but the 9 million strong Israel crushing the 2.2 million strong Gaza. This is how boomers and zoomers see the war differently. Just like how the Holocaust is a distant memory for many that might as well be relegated to the same era as the Boer War, many are growing up right in the middle of the conflict without understanding what happened in the past 30 years and how we got here. What boomers, Gen X and millennials grew up with is far different than what zoomers grew up with. Why are boomers more pro-Israel than younger generations? Probably proximity to World War II veterans. They grew up with documentaries about the Holocaust that explicitly showed the victims of the concentration camps and knew people who fought in Europe. For more modern generations, it's more history than something that happened in living memory. As a consequence, there's less guilt over the horror of World War II and Jews and more emphasis on the balance of Palestinian and Israeli interests/behavior. I would strongly recommend taking a listen to this webinar Dr. Shibli Telhami of the University of Maryland did at the Council on Foreign Relations. He outlines 4 factors that have caused a shift among younger progressive Americans on the Israel-Palestine issue. 1. They are less white and less male than any other subgroup, and women and people of color are more likely to sympathize with Palestinians. 2. Social media use. Higher social media use means that information young Americans receive is different than the mainstream, traditional media. To add my own example here, many of my peers follow Palestinian reporters working directly in Gaza, for example Plestia Alakad. 3. Democrats have begun looking at the issue through a more social justice-influenced lens versus Republicans looking at it through a realist foreign policy or biblical lens. 4. For the past decade and a half, Israel has had a deeply conservative government led by Netanyahu. While older voters might distinguish between Netanyahu's government and the Israeli government/state as a whole, younger voters only know Netanyahu's policy goals as that of Israel as a whole. They grew up before the Palestinians switched from their Egyptian-style propaganda campaign to their South African-style campaign. Pre-1990, the Palestinians focused on their blood right to the land and the annihilation of Jews. It worked for Egypt in 1956, it should work in Palestine, right? Wrong. The Israelis also had a blood right to the land, so the Westerners could back them in good conscience. But in the 1990s, the Palestinians' chief supporter in the USSR collapsed, and that was a serious blow to their military capabilities. But South Africa showed that racism was now a weak point in Western support. Hamas keyed in on this first, and leveraged the Palestinian diaspora to spin a new story about racism. And this one worked. Anybody who started paying attention after the 90s is more likely to support Palestine because this argument resonates where the other one doesn't. You are not immune to propaganda.